Okay, let's dive in. What is consciousness,
Yeah.
really? And what about reality? I mean, is the world we perceive around us, truly out there, solid, independent?
Or is it something else entirely, something maybe more dynamic, even fluid?
Okay.
These aren't just like abstract philosophical games. They're absolutely fundamental questions. And they drove the work of, well, a really fascinating and boundary-pushing figure, Dr. Jacobo Grinberg-Zylberbaum.
Right.
He was really trying to answer these huge mysteries by weaving together fields that you wouldn't normally think go together: psychophysiology, quantum physics, even ancient traditions.
It's quite a mix. And our deep dive today, we're pulling directly from the source material you provided us with these excerpts from his book, The Conscious Brain, Psychophysiology of Consciousness, too.
Mm-hmm.
And the book's core aim, as Grinberg himself puts it, is basically to lay out his whole psychophysiological theory of the unified field.
Mm.
And, the fundamentals of how he was thinking about consciousness and reality.
That's right. So our mission today is really to explore Grinberg's perspective, which, let's be honest, is pretty radical.
Definitely.
We'll be drawing directly from the specific ideas in these pages, his insights into, well, the nature of reality, consciousness, space, time, and this really profound connection he saw between the brain and the universe itself.
And, well, you should prepare yourself, because this is absolutely a journey to concepts that will challenge your conventional understanding, for sure.
Oh, absolutely. It's packed with surprising insights, unexpected connections, and yeah, we'll even get into some of the experimental evidence he talks about. Evidence he uses to support these often quite extraordinary claims.
Okay, so where do we start? What's the foundation?
Let's start right at the beginning with Grinberg's foundational perspective. For him, true knowledge, real understanding, it all begins with solving the mystery of how experience is created.
How experience is created, not just what it is, but how.
Exactly. This isn't just philosophy for him. It's the central scientific problem he's trying to crack.
And right off the bat, he hits us with a really kind of mind-bending idea, doesn't he?
He does. The idea that our perceived reality, the one we just assume is solid and, essential, is often, maybe even primarily, illusory.
Illusory, how so?
Well, he argues that what we see as distinct, solid objects, they're simply perceptions. They're transformations of underlying patterns, right? And these patterns don't fundamentally differ in their dimensional nature from what we think of as empty space.
Whoa. Okay, so the chair I'm sitting on isn't fundamentally different from the air around it, just perceived differently.
That's the core idea. He views perception itself as a transformation process. You start with what he calls an undifferentiated energetic matrix, like a field of potential.
Okay.
That matrix becomes neuronal activity in the brain. That's the step we sort of understand. But then, and this is crucial, this neuronal activity gets transformed back into subjective experience, into the percepts we know as the world.
Back into experience. So the content, the redness of red, the hardness of the chair, that's the result of this transformation.
Precisely. That specific content is a relative aspect, a transformation of something more fundamental. It's not the ultimate reality itself.
But he makes a really important distinction there, right?
No.
Even if the content is relative or illusory.
Yes, exactly. While the content might be relative, the phenomenon of experiencing itself, the simple, undeniable fact that we perceive, that we feel, that we are conscious, that for Grinberg is absolutely fundamental. It's not just some accessory feature.
So the bedrock.
It's the bedrock. That core fact of experiencing, of perceiving from what he poetically calls an empty balcony, that's what his entire theory aims to explain.
Okay, so where does he go from there to explain it?
Well, surprisingly, perhaps, he starts with something most of us think of as, well, nothing. He starts with space.
Space, not matter, not energy first. That seems
Oh.
backwards somehow.
It does seem counterintuitive, I agree. But Grinberg asserts that everything that exists is space. Just space at different levels of organization. Space is the primordial basis, the fundamental stuff, and ultimately, it's all one unified entity. He kind of riffs on the idea that understanding time is wisdom, but argues, look, since space underlies time, understanding space is the real key to wisdom, even more fundamental.
So space isn't just the stage, the passive backdrop for the play. It is the play and the actors and the stage itself.
In a manner of speaking, yes. It's the fundamental substance, just arranged in different ways. He moves beyond the Kantian idea of space as purely a priori, like a fixed mental framework. He respects that view, but his analysis leans heavily on Einstein.
Ah, okay. Like Einstein's curved space-time, where gravity isn't a force in space, but a curvature of space.
Exactly. That's his reference point space as this concrete, organized energy network. It's curved, it's influenced by gravity, by time, it's dynamic.
But he takes it even further, doesn't he, into multidimensional space?
He does, and this is where things get even more mind-bending, drawing on thinkers like Ouspensky, Hinton, Dunn-Gurdjieff, people who explored these ideas of higher dimensions.
Right, the idea of spaces within spaces, layers of reality we might not normally tune into.
Precisely. The core idea is that our perception of dimensions isn't fixed. It's limited by our level of awareness, or maybe our biological development. Our everyday 3D world, he sees that as just a section, like a slice, through a larger, maybe 4D universe.
And in that 4D universe, time isn't something we move through.
Exactly. Time becomes another spatial dimension that we just happen to perceive sequentially, moment by moment, because of our limited perceptual apparatus.
Okay, that's always been hard to visualize. The 2D flatlander analogy helps, though, right?
It really does. Imagine a being living entirely on a flat plane. If you slowly lower a 3D sphere through their 2D world,
They wouldn't see a sphere. They'd see what? A point appearing, expanding to a circle, then shrinking back to a point, and vanishes.
exactly. They perceive changing circles over time. They can't grasp the 3D volume all at once.
Or Ouspensky's two-dimensional Viper example, seeing a moving cube not as a solid, but as just a series of changing 2D shapes appearing and disappearing.
Perfect. And Grinberg suggests we're like that Viper or that Flatlander when it comes to the fourth dimension. We perceive this sequence of moments, what we call time, but maybe a hypothetical four-dimensional being could perceive our past, present, and future all coexisting, spatially laid out somehow.
Wow. And he suggests a way we might perceive this, something about the present moment.
Yes, this is a key idea he returns to. He suggests that a crucial step towards perceiving this higher dimensional reality could be an expansion of the duration of our subjective present.
Expanding the now. So our feeling of the present moment isn't fixed. It could actually stretch.
That's the radical idea, that the window of now could widen, allowing us to perceive more of that spatialized time, perhaps even the connections between events we normally see as separate.
Okay, a flexible present. That's a big concept.
It's central to his theory, and it ties directly into his next major point, the space-matter continuum.
Right. Building on space is this organized energy network.
Exactly. Grinberg posits that space and matter aren't fundamentally different kinds of things. They're just parts of a single continuous spectrum, a continuum.
And the differences.
The difference lies purely in their organization and complexity.
So matter isn't sitting in space. It is space, just configured in a certain way.
Yeah.
A way our brains can grasp.
Precisely that. What we call matter are those portions of the space-matter continuum whose organization is, relatively speaking, less complex. Less complex enough that our brains have evolved the capacity to algorithmize them.
Algorithmize, like reduce the pattern to a formula.
Yeah, essentially. To decode its structure and reduce it to a symbolic pattern or formula, think of the chemical formula for water, H2O, or the incredibly complex but still algorithmic structure of DNA. Our brains can process these levels of organization.
And what about transparent space, the space we see through?
In Grinberg's view, transparent space is simply that part of the continuum whose organization is too complex, too informationally dense for our current decoding capacity. It exceeds our brain's processing power, so it remains transparent, unseen in its structure.
And the key thing here is that the difference between seeing something as solid versus transparent isn't inherent in the space itself.
No, it's solely a product of brain activity. We literally materialize space through the act of perception. When our brain successfully decodes and organizes a specific region of this continuum, we experience it as a material object.
And if it can't decode it,
Yeah.
it stays transparent.
Exactly. Areas whose energetic organization is too complex, too synergistic, just remain transparent to us.
He uses some specific terms here, right? Organization, algorithmization, decoding.
Yes, just to clarify. Organization is about how the elements within space relate and interact, often with a lot of redundancy, meaning the same information is present in multiple places. Algorithmization is that process of reducing the complex organization down to a manageable symbolic formula or pattern.
Like the H2O example.
Right. And decoding is simply our brain's capacity to actually perform that algorithmic reduction, to make sense of the pattern.
And complexity is measured by how many elements, how they interact, how hard the algorithm is.
Exactly. He uses this image picture space as a gigantic, intricate spiderweb. Matter appears where the lines of the web thicken or curve or intersect in complex ways that our brains have learned to recognize and process.
And crucially, he argues this ability to perceive, to decode space, isn't fixed. It's not static.
No, it's evolved. It's not a plastic, as he says. Humans, over evolutionary time, phylogenetically, and through our own individual development ontogenetically, have developed the capacity to detect and perceive certain spatial organizations as material objects.
He even speculates that maybe ancient humans perceived reality differently.
Yeah, he throws out the idea that maybe millions of years ago, humans might have perceived structures we now see as solid as transparent, and maybe vice versa. The decoding ability itself changed.
It sounds a bit like, well, like folklore almost.
Sure.
He mentions things like historical perceptions of gnomes or spirits, or that really intriguing claim about certain Amazonian tribes who can supposedly perceptually solidify space, even using it for levitation. He references Scott Robinson there.
He does, and within his framework, these aren't just weird anecdotes. They illustrate the core idea. The boundary between material and transparent isn't fixed out there in the world. It's contingent on us, on our brain's perceptual and decoding abilities.
Abilities which, theoretically, could be trained or expanded.
That's the implication. Just as we normally materialize space through perception, he suggests the opposite might also be possible dematerialization, or perceiving the structure in what normally looks transparent.
Okay, so let's recap the characteristics of this space organization. It's variable, gives rise to objects, it contains information, points affect other points, and the information is redundant.
Correct. And if we could perceive all the simultaneous organizing points, if our decoding capacity were vastly greater,
What would that be like?
well, he suggests it would grant us an extraordinary capacity. We'd see the direct, instantaneous influences spreading across all of space. Remember his bird flight analogy?
Vaguely. Remind me.
We see a bird fly, we understand light travels from the bird to our eyes, modifying the space between us. But in his model, the bird's flight isn't just a local event. It actually modifies all of space simultaneously. It creates these expanding spheres of change, like ripples on a cosmic pond, but in all dimensions.
Ripples everywhere, instantaneously.
That's the idea. We don't normally perceive these global ripples because the highly organized, high information density, transparent space carrying that information, it just exceeds our current decoding ability. Our
Right.
perception is limited.
Limited by the complexity we can handle.
Exactly. And remember, this spatial organization isn't just visual, not just about light waves. Space is organized by chemical particles that smell, by wind patterns, by elementary particles, radio waves, all sorts of energy fields.
So theoretically, training could expand our senses beyond the usual 5.
Grinberg strongly suggests that. Adequate training in decoding and analyzing these various forms of spatial information could, he believes, vastly increase human cognitive and perceptual capacity way beyond our current sensory limits.
Which brings us squarely to the role of the brain in all this decoding and materializing.
Yes. He proposes something really fundamental, that the brain's own organization, its structure and function, is itself a kind of logical materialization of the organization of space.
The brain mirrors space.
In a way. It's evolved over vast timescales specifically to decode and analyze space in the particular way necessary for our survival. He gives the example of the retina. Its structure, its size, its processing abilities might be directly determined by the specific organization of the space we inhabit and the parts of it we need to process most efficiently.
Okay. And the brain has to deal with all this potentially redundant information coming from space, right? You mentioned redundancy earlier.
Yes, absolutely. Space is highly redundant, meaning the same information is often present in many places. The brain needs a way to handle this, otherwise we'd perceive multiple overlapping images of the same thing. He talks about inclusion operations in the central nervous system.
Inclusion operations.
These are mechanisms, likely involving those convergent circuits we'll discuss more, that manage the redundancy. They essentially unify the information, preventing us from seeing, say, 10 slightly different versions of the same coffee cup, just because information about it is arriving from slightly different points in space or slightly different times.
It integrates the redundant signals into one percept.
Exactly. He also proposes this idea of a space-cell-brain continuum.
Okay, what does that mean?
He suggests there's a fundamental continuity, a similarity in the underlying energetic patterns across these different levels, the structure of space itself, the processes within a single cell, and the complex activity of the brain. These similarities arise, he thinks, because they're all part of the same interconnected energetic network involving dimensional transformations of logical contents.
Dimensional transformation.
Yeah, it gets abstract. But he points to things like the ancient wisdom in the I Ching, whose creators, he notes, observed incredible parallels between natural events, which he links to space organization, and the workings of consciousness linked to the brain. He suggests this isn't just analogy, it might reflect a real underlying similarity in the energetic patterns because everything is interconnected and mutually stimulating.
So where do these energy patterns, this organization in space, actually come from? What generates it?
That's a really deep question. Grinberg suggests that material bodies themselves, stars, planets, plants, us, actively nourish space through their own organization. They are concentrations of organized energetic content within the larger spatial field.
So we contribute to the structure of space just by existing.
That seems to be his idea. But then the question is, what contains all these patterns? What is the ultimate container or medium? He acknowledges that historical attempts to answer this, like the old idea of the luminiferous ether, have failed. It's a genuinely difficult problem.
Okay, so space is this fundamental, dynamic, organized energy network. Matter is just a specific kind of organization within it. And this structure, this organization, is where his key concept of synergy comes in.
Syntergy, yes. This is absolutely central to Grinberg's entire theoretical structure. It's crucial.
Define it for us again.
Okay. A region of space is said to have synergistic organization or high synergy if each point or quantum within that region contains a high concentration of information about the rest of the space. The more information about the whole is packed into each tiny part, the higher the synergy.
Could you give an example to make that clear?
Sure. He uses the example of deep intergalactic space, far away from any stars or planets. He sees this as having extremely high synergy. Why? Because a tiny point, a minimum quantum of that space, theoretically contains information about vast stretches of the rest of the universe, light from distant galaxies, gravitational influences, etc.
Okay, so emptiness is informationally dense, in a way.
Paradoxically, yes, in terms of information about the whole. Now, contrast that with the space right next to a massive star. As you get closer to a material body, the points in space contain relatively less information about the whole universe and more localized information. So, synergy decreases as you approach matter.
So matter itself represents regions of relatively low synergy.
Relatively speaking, yes. Material objects are concentrations of organization, but this localized organization means each point holds less information about the global state. High synergy space is also characterized by high redundancy.
Redundancy, like the moon seeming to follow you in the car.
Exactly. That's his example. The light quanta reaching you are highly redundant regarding the moon's position information. Low synergy space, like the space constituting matter itself, has minimal redundancy. The information is highly specific and localized.
And he breaks synergy down into 4 specific properties.
He does. These are the defining characteristics. 1, the size of the minimum quantum of space involved. 2, the degree of quantum redundancy. 3, the amount of informational content packed into each quantum. 4, and the quantum temporal content, how much duration or time is included or represented within each quantum.
And these 4 things are all interconnected. How?
Absolutely. It works like this. Greater synergy means greater redundancy, greater informational content per quantum, and greater temporal content included per quantum. Interestingly, he also links higher synergy to fewer effective dimensions in the sense of how we perceive complexity.
Fewer dimensions. That seems odd.
It's about the type of organization. High synergy is more unified, less differentiated, perhaps closer to a point-like state informationally. Conversely, low synergy closer to matter means less redundancy, less informational content per quantum about the whole, less temporal content included, and greater effective dimensions like the familiar 3D world we perceive as solid.
Okay, this is intricate. But the payoff is huge, because he then connects synergy directly to fundamental physics, to gravity and time.
This is probably one of his boldest and most ambitious theoretical leaps. He posits that gravitational force and the flow of time are not fundamental separate things, but are direct alterations or manifestations of the syntergic organization of space.
How does that work for gravity?
An increase in gravitational force, like what you find near a massive object like a star or planet, is, in his model, equivalent to a reduction in the synergy of the surrounding space. It means reduced informational redundancy and a decrease in the concentration of global information in each quantum of space near the mass.
So stronger gravity means lower synergy. The space is less informationally dense about the whole.
Precisely. And conversely, Decreased gravity further away from mass corresponds to increased redundancy and informational concentration, meaning higher synergy.
And what about time?
The relationship with time is just as explicit and, frankly, stunning. He states that time passes more slowly in a space of high synergy, high redundancy, high information concentration, and time passes more quickly in a space of low synergy, low redundancy, low information concentration, like near matter.
Wow. So time dilation near massive objects. Einstein predicted this, and it's been experimentally verified.
Yes, and Grinberg explicitly points to this. He references the classic experiment using atomic clocks placed at different altitudes, one near sea level, one high up. The clock at higher altitude, where gravity is slightly weaker, and thus synergy is slightly higher, in his terms, measurably ran faster relative to the one closer to Earth's stronger gravity, lower synergy.
No, wait. Faster at higher altitude? I thought time slowed down near mass.
Ah, you're right. I misspoke there, referencing the altitude experiment directly against his terms. Let me clarify Grinberg's connection and the standard relativity finding. Einstein's relativity predicts time slows down closer to a massive object, stronger gravity. The atomic clock experiment confirms this. The clock closer to Earth runs slower than the one higher up.
Okay, so how does Grinberg's synergy fit that? Stronger gravity will lower synergy.
Right. So lower synergy near mass correlates with slower time flow. Higher synergy, weaker gravity further from mass, correlates with faster time flow. My apologies for the mix-up in applying his terms to the standard result initially. The key point is he sees the experimental result of time dilation as direct support for his idea that time flow is intrinsically linked to the syntergic organization of space, which is itself altered by gravity mass.
Oh, okay, that makes more sense now. Lower synergy near mass equals slower time. Higher synergy
Away
from mass, faster time. And this link is supported by observed time dilation.
Exactly. It offers this framework where gravity and time aren't just background features, but are emergent properties of the informational structure of space itself.
And because of the space-matter continuum, time must flow differently through this whole organization, right?
Yeah.
Matter being low synergy.
Experiences time flowing more slowly relative to the higher synergy transparent space around it. There isn't one universal clock tick. Time flow varies depending on the local syntergic organization.
This is huge. Now, how does our subjective experience of time fit in?
He introduces the concept of global time. This isn't the time of physics, but our perceived present moment. He suggests this unified, hyper-complex experience of now emerges synergistically. It's the sum total, the integration of all the countless elemental temporal processes happening constantly within our bodies, cellular reactions, neuronal firing patterns, atomic vibrations, everything, all integrated over a very short duration.
That's short.
He estimates it around 50 milliseconds, roughly, for a typical adult human brain. This integration window creates our smooth, flowing sense of the present. It's an emergent property of the brain's complexity.
So our subjective time is constructed by the brain integrating billions of micro-events.
Yes, and he proposes that the brain achieves this time management, this creation of a unified present, by building hierarchical levels of convergence. These are the processes that integrate and unify information.
Convergence, like bringing things together.
Exactly. And our ability to perceive reality then involves our brain decoding the various time synergies, the different temporal flows and information structures present in the wider space-matter continuum.
But our perception is limited.
It's limited by the range of our own global time, that 50 meters window. This is why, he argues, the incredibly complex time organization within high synergy transparent space often exceeds our perceptual capacity. We can't easily see its structure like we see lower synergy matter because its temporal dynamics are too fast or too complex for our integration window.
Unless we could expand our global time. That idea again.
Precisely. An expanded global time, a longer integration window, could theoretically allow us to perceive spatial organizations, syntergic structures that are normally invisible or transparent to us. It could allow us to materialize more of reality.
Okay, so we have space as organized energy, synergy, influencing time and gravity. We have the brain decoding this space, limited by its global time. The big question remains, how does raw brain activity actually become subjective experience, consciousness itself?
This is the absolute core of his theory. He proposes it emerges from the interaction of two fundamental brain processes. First, what he calls the brain's inclusive logic.
Inclusive logic.
This is the brain's inherent tendency, its built-in mechanism, to unify dispersed elements into cohesive units. Think gestalts in perception seeing a whole shape, not just dots, or forming abstract concepts by finding commonalities. This unification happens via convergence circuits.
Convergence circuits again, taking many inputs and creating fewer, more unified outputs.
Exactly. He sees this as a biological manifestation of a universal principal complexity arising from the inclusion of simpler elements. Atoms making molecules, Newton's physics being included in Einstein's. Convergent circuits extract the commonalities, the shared patterns, from diverse inputs and create unified codes or algorithms representing them.
Dating many pieces, finding the shared essence, creating a whole. Okay, that's the first process. What's the second?
The second is the generation of neuronal energy fields. He argues that the collective electrochemical activity of billions of neurons doesn't just stay inside the brain tissue. It creates an energy field that expands outwards, extending into the space around the brain.
A field generated by the brain's activity.
Yes, an energetic field, and subjective experience, consciousness, arises from the interaction of this neuronal field with the energetic organization of space with the Syntergy field we've been discussing.
Oh, he gives this interaction a specific name, doesn't he?
He calls it the synapse of experience. It's a beautiful, powerful image. The brain's field synapsing with the universe's field. That interaction is experience.
So experience isn't in the brain alone or in space alone, but in the meeting place, the interaction zone.
That's his proposal. And what the brain specifically contributes to this interaction, he argues, is directionality and focus. The brain focuses this field interaction, and that focused interaction is what creates specific perceptual content, the particular quality of red, the pitch of a sound, the feeling of warmth.
And it also creates our sense of time.
Yes, the brain's focusing activity also generates our subjective phenomenological experience of time flowing.
If it's about the interaction of fields, does distance matter?
Theoretically, perhaps not in the way we usually think, because it's about the interaction between the brain's field, which might extend, and the universal space field. He postulates this could be the basis for phenomena that seem to defy distance, like potentially telepathy or even astral projection. The experience arises from the focused interaction, not necessarily from something traveling between points A and B.
He's careful to emphasize that the subjective qualities, light, sound, etc., don't exist as those qualities in the raw field, right?
Absolutely. They're not in the basic neuronal firing patterns either. They emerge, he says, from a fundamental change in dimensional nature that occurs during this interaction at the level of the emergent neuronal field connecting with space.
This is definitely unconventional stuff. What kind of evidence does he actually point to? Does he cite experiments supporting this idea of brain fields interacting with space?
He does mention several lines of evidence, though some are more observational or anecdotal than strictly controlled. He talks about experiments where subjects were asked to visualize a cube internally. Apparently, they could indicate its perceived position and even, outline its shape in the space around them, suggesting to him that the mental image had a real, spatially localized, energetic counterpart.
A mental image affecting external space.
Yeah.
That's pretty out there.
It is. He also mentions other experiments, like people using a pendulum to find an object they had previously touched, or to choose a specific book from a shelf. He interprets successful results in these tasks as evidence of a spatially expanding energy field generated by the person, carrying information about the object or the intention.
Okay. Pendulums are often seen as related to unconscious muscle movements, though.
That's the standard explanation, yes.
Right.
Grinberg, however, interprets these findings within his own framework of energy fields interacting with space. He also cites observations suggesting cognitive activity can influence physical processes directly, like people allegedly influencing the movement or brightness of candle flames through focused mental states.
Influencing flames.
That's what he reports observing. He also mentions qualitative observations suggesting direct brain-to-brain transmission of emotions between people in close proximity, implying a field interaction.
This is starting to sound like some of the more famous and controversial claims, like Uri Geller bending spoons.
He actually does cite reports related to Uri Geller's demonstrations, and interestingly, claims that children observing Geller were sometimes able to replicate the metal bending effects afterwards. He sees these as potential, if extreme, examples of focused intention or neural fields affecting the space-matter continuum directly.
And his own experiments with coin tosses.
Yes, he mentions conducting experiments where subjects tried to voluntarily influence the outcome of coin tosses based on specific internal states or intentions. He claims results significantly different from chance, mentioning a probability against chance of less than 0.0001, suggesting a non-random influence originating from the subject's mental state.
These are certainly extraordinary claims, requiring extraordinary evidence, which seems mixed, perhaps. How does he frame them scientifically?
He frames them as evidence supporting the hypothesis that energy fields generated by the brain and body can interact with and affect the space-matter continuum in measurable ways. For him, they bolster the core idea that brain activity isn't just confined inside the skull, but actively participates in shaping reality through these field interactions.
But he acknowledges the speculative nature.
Oh, yes. He explicitly states these findings hint at potential future applications, maybe influencing time, gravity, materialization, levitation. But he stresses the absolute need for rigorous, key experiments to scientifically validate these far-reaching possibilities. He's proposing a framework, not claiming final proof for everything.
Okay, let's loop back to the brain's internal workings for a moment. You mentioned inclusive logic and convergent circuits as key to creating unified experience. Can we unpack that a bit more, especially the link to the expanded present?
Absolutely. So inclusive logic relies on these convergent circuits. Think of it like a funnel. Many neurons carrying specific bits of information synapse onto fewer neurons at the next level. These higher-level neurons integrate the input, extracting commonalities and creating more complex unified codes or algorithms.
It's an information concentration process.
Exactly. It's the biological basis for how we perceive unified wholes. Gestalt perception is a prime example. We see a face, not just disconnected eyes, nose, mouth. The brain actively unifies the elements through convergence, and accessing higher and higher hierarchical levels of these convergent circuits means processing more abstract, more unified information.
And this relates back to the duration of the present moment. How?
Yes. Grinberg argues that a neural algorithm, a pattern of activity formed at a high convergence level, necessarily integrates information from processes that occurred over a longer duration at lower levels. Think about understanding a sentence you need to hold the beginning in mind as you process the end. That integration requires time.
So higher convergence means integrating over longer time periods.
That's the idea. This integration across time contributes to the subjective experience of an expanded present moment. He draws that parallel again to a quantum of space containing starlight that left different stars at different times in the past. Both the brain circuit and the space quantum are concentrating information across time.
And did he find physiological correlates for this? Specific brain activity linked to an expanded present.
He reported observing a correlation. He found that experiences associated with an expansion of the present seemed correlated with high-frequency EEG activity, what's often called brain desynchronization. Conversely, low-frequency EEG, or synchronization, seemed correlated with a shorter, more focused present moment.
High-frequency expanded present. Does that fit with other findings?
He notes it aligns with reports linking states of creativity, insight, and complex problem-solving, often associated with an expanded awareness to these desynchronized high-frequency brain states.
Interesting. And he sees brain development as related to this.
Yes, he postulates that the development of the central nervous system, both over evolution, phylogeny, and within an individual's lifetime ontogeny, involves the creation of new, higher levels of convergence. This is reflected, he suggests, in the general increase in dominant EEG frequencies as a child matures, enabling more abstract thought and complex processing.
So accessing different levels of these convergent circuits could literally change your reality.
That's the profound implication. He even cites studies on psychedelic experiences, like those by Leary and others, suggesting they might involve accessing brain processing levels, inclusion levels that are different from those normally active, leading to radically altered states of consciousness.
And he contrasts this with Eastern practices.
He does. He contrasts the typical Western developmental trajectory of building higher and higher inclusion levels, more abstract thought, with some Eastern practices, like certain yogic meditations, which aim to lower EEG frequency and access more fundamental, preconceptual, elemental levels of experience. This access to low inclusion levels, he suggests, might underlie mystical states of unity or undifferentiated awareness.
So you can move up or down these levels of complexity in the brain, and each level corresponds to a different kind of experience.
That seems to be the idea. Accessing different inclusion levels fundamentally alters the nature of the reality you experience.
And here's the crucial link. Back this expansion of the present, achieved through accessing higher inclusion levels. This is directly related to the ability to perceive or materialize space.
Absolutely. He posits they are intimately connected. Expanding the subjective present, which involves creating or activating a higher convergence level, simultaneously expands the brain's capacity to decode more complex spatial organization, the kind of organization found in what we normally perceive as transparent space.
So longer, now ability to see more structure in empty space.
That's the hypothesized relationship. The expansion of the present, accessing higher inclusion levels, and the materialization of space, perceiving its complex organization, are all facets of the same underlying process of increasing the brain's decoding power through managing time and convergence.
Okay, that's a complex but intriguing connection. Now, you mentioned Appendix B in his book delves deeper into how neuronal activity becomes experience, especially vision.
Yes, he revisits the core idea there. Visual perception isn't about seeing objects directly, but about decoding the wave-like organization of space.
Right. Could you walk us through that process again as he describes it?
Sure, it starts with information, structured as patterns or waves coming from space. This interacts with the retina, gets transduced into basic neural codes, primarily action potentials, nerve impulses, and the spatial location of which neurons are firing.
Standard neuroscience so far.
Pretty much. This coded information travels up to the cerebral cortex, and here, according to Grinberg, is where the magic happens. The complex interactions between billions of activated cortical neurons create something new, a four-dimensional energetic neuronal field.
A 4D field.
Yeah.
Generated by the 3D brain.
Yes, it's an emergent property of the collective neuronal activity existing in space and time. And this field, he argues, is the direct antecedent of our subjective visual percepts, the experience of light, color, shape, movement.
So the quality of redness isn't just neuron X firing, but a property of this emergent field.
Precisely. He stresses that these subjective qualities don't exist as such in the elemental neuronal activity, the action potentials. They arise from a fundamental change in dimensional nature and interaction at the level of this emergent neuronal field interacting with the spatial information.
And this field is then processed further.
Yes. It's then acted upon by those convergent circuits we keep mentioning. They reduce the complexity of the field, extracting patterns, creating more abstract representations, eventually leading to the inclusive patterns that form the basis for language and abstract thought.
He tackles a classic problem here too, right? The binding problem. How does all this dispersed brain activity create a single unified picture?
He does. He offers two potential, maybe complementary answers. One possibility is that the emergent neuronal field itself provides the unification. Its structure inherently binds the information together. The other possibility involves the action of highly convergent neurons, particularly polymodal neurons, neurons that respond to multiple senses, acting as containers or integrators, unifying information from vast networks.
And he did that experiment described in Appendix B, the one with the vertical line interpreted as 1 or I, that relates to this.
Yes, it's a very clever evoked potential study designed to probe how the brain handles meaning, which is related to unification and transformation. They showed subjects the exact same visual stimulus, a vertical line, but they changed the context, asking subjects to think of it either as the number 1 or the letter I.
Same stimulus, different meaning.
Exactly. And they recorded the brain's electrical responses, EEG, and evoked potentials. The key finding was statistically significant differences in the brain waves depending on the meaning the subject assigned to the line.
Where in the brain were these differences strongest?
Crucially, not primarily in the occipital lobe, the main visual processing area at the back of the brain. The biggest differences showed up later in time, around 100-300 milliseconds after the stimulus, and were strongest over the parietal and temporal lobes.
What does that signify?
It strongly suggests that these higher-level association areas are much more involved in processing the meaning or interpretation of a stimulus, while the occipital lobe is more concerned with its basic physical characteristics. Meaning isn't localized. It involves a distributed network across parietal, temporal, and likely frontal lobes.
So our subjective experience is clearly shaped by this higher-level processing, not just raw sensory input.
Absolutely. It supports the idea that experience emerges from complex, distributed brain activity that transforms, interprets, and unifies information.
And this ties back to the duration of the present, that 50 meters window needed for these interactions.
It does. He reiterates that this approximate duration is the time required for the necessary neuronal interactions and convergences to occur to form a unified moment of experience. He also adds a nuance here in the appendix. While his main text linked high-frequency EEG to an expanded present, he acknowledges the relationship is complex and depends on the specific brain area and the nature of the task, affecting how information gets integrated within that temporal window.
He also notes the brain isn't a blank slate, right? Like newborns preferring faces.
Yes, the brain's inherent structure already contains certain information or biases that facilitate processing familiar or evolutionarily important stimuli. And he elaborates on how we reconstruct information internally, like hearing a familiar name and instantly picturing the person's face.
How does he explain that process?
He describes it as a chain. The sound code of the name activates the temporal cortex, which then accesses convergence circuits. These activate polymodal neurons where the combined pattern, name plus face, is stored. This activation then triggers divergence circuits, sending signals back down to activate a specific neuronal field pattern in the visual cortex, which is then experienced as the internal visual image of the face.
So mental imagery uses the same core mechanism activating these neuronal fields as perceiving the external world.
That's his hypothesis. Whether triggered externally or internally, the transformation of neuronal activity into subjective experience involves the creation and modulation of these energetic neuronal fields interacting with organized information patterns.
Okay, let's switch gears slightly and connect another piece of his research from Appendix A back into this wider framework. This was the really unexpected link he explored between immunological changes and learning.
Yes, it seems like a strange connection at first glance, but Grinberg was struck by the parallels he saw between how the immune system works recognizing foreign invaders, producing specific antibodies, developing memory for pathogens, and the processes of behavioral learning and memory in the brain.
What kinds of parallels?
Well, both processes are highly specific. Both result in relatively permanent changes. Both seem to follow similar functional laws, things like savings, relearning is faster, the need for reinforcement, phenomena like extinction and recovery. Both involve distinct short-term and long-term memory phases. He saw them both as fundamentally mnemonic phenomena, ways the organism records and responds to significant encounters.
So the immune system remembering a virus isn't fundamentally different from the brain remembering how to navigate a maze.
Based on these formal similarities, he developed a pretty radical hypothesis. What if behavioral learning itself actually triggers the production of specific chemical substances in the brain that have antigenic characteristics? Substances that the immune system could recognize and react to, just like it reacts to a bacterium.
Learning creates brain molecules that act like antigens.
That was the hypothesis he set out to test experimentally.
And how did he do that? He described an experiment with cats and rats.
Yes, the core experiment went like this. First, he trained a group of rats on various learning tasks. He also had a control group of rats that weren't trained. Then he prepared brain homogenates, basically, mashed up brain tissue from both the trained rats and the untrained rats.
Okay, brain mush from trained and untrained rats. Then what?
Then he used these different brain homogenates to immunize two groups of cats. One group of cats got injections of the trained rat brain mush. The other group got injections of the untrained rat brain mush. The idea was the cat's immune systems would produce antibodies against whatever was in the rat brains.
Right, so the cats immunized with trained brains might produce antibodies against normal brain stuff, plus any unique learning molecules.
Exactly. That was the hope. After the cats had time to develop an immune response, he collected blood serum from them, which contains the antibodies they produced.
And how did he check if there was an antibody specific to the learning process?
He used a standard immunological technique called passive gel diffusion, the Autreloni method. You put a sample of the cat serum with the antibodies in a central well on a special gel plate, and then you put samples of the different rat brain homogenates, the antigens, in wells surrounding it. Everything diffuses out through the gel.
And if an antibody meets its specific antigen,
they bind together and form a visible line or band of precipitation in the gel where they meet. So he was looking to see if different combinations produce different patterns of bands.
what did he find? Was there a unique band?
This was the crucial finding. The serum from cats that had been immunized with trained rat brains, when tested against antigens from both trained and untrained brains, consistently produced at least two distinct precipitation bands.
Two bands. And the control groups.
In contrast, serum from cats immunized with untrained brains only produced a single band when tested against either type of brain homogenate. Also, if you tested the trained cat serum only against untrained brain homogenate, you also typically only got one band.
So that second band only appeared reliably when trained cat serum met brain material that had undergone learning.
That was his interpretation, yes. The presence of multiple bands strongly suggested that the trained brain-immunized cats had produced at least two different classes of antibodies. One was likely a general antibody reacting to common brain components found in both groups, but the new second band, he argued, represented an antibody specifically generated against a substance, or substances, produced or modified in the brain as a result of the learning process in the trained rats.
That's a pretty remarkable claim in itself. Learning has a specific, detectable immunological signature in the brain.
It really is. He felt this demonstrated that the process of learning involves the synthesis or alteration of unique molecules within the brain that are capable of triggering a specific immune response.
Yeah, there was a second experiment described, right? One that didn't quite pan out.
That's correct. In a follow-up study, they tried to take the next step. Using rabbits this time and focusing specifically on the caudate nucleus, an area thought to be involved in learning, they attempted to purify this hypothesized learning-specific antibody. Then they injected this purified antibody directly into the caudate nucleus of rats that had already been trained on a specific task, passive avoidance learning.
What was the goal of injecting it?
And they wanted to see if the antibody, by binding to its target learning molecule in the brain, would disrupt the long-term memory retention of the learned task. If the molecule was essential for the memory, maybe the antibody would block it.
And did it? Did it make the rats forget?
No, it didn't. The results showed no significant difference in memory retention between the rats that got the antibody injection and the control groups that got placebo injections. The antibody didn't seem to impair the memory.
So the antibody existed, according to the first experiment, but didn't seem to do anything to the memory in the second experiment. How did Grinberg reconcile that?
He discussed several possibilities for the negative result. Maybe they hadn't purified enough of the antibody, or it wasn't concentrated enough when injected. Maybe the specific learning task they used was too simple or had become too strongly ingrained, overlearned, to be easily disrupted. Maybe the caudate nucleus wasn't the primary site for storing that particular memory, although he cited literature suggesting it should be involved.
But he didn't think the negative result invalidated the first experiment.
No, he explicitly argued it didn't. He emphasized that the failure to disrupt memory in the second experiment didn't undermine the finding from the first experiment, namely that a novel antibody associated with the training process had been created. He pointed out the methodological differences. Different species used for immunization, cats versus rabbits, different brain regions used as antigen sources, whole brain versus caudate nucleus, different procedures, making a direct comparison difficult.
So even with that null result on memory interference, he stood by the core finding. Learning produces something immunologically detectable.
Yes, and this finding, even with the complexities, fueled an even grander unified hypothesis for him. He proposed that both immunological reactions and behavioral learning are fundamentally related because both involve alterations in time.
Alterations in time, how does that connect?
He connects it back to his core theory of synergy. He views both processes as fundamental interactions between energetic morphologies that alter the organization of space-time, the Syntergic field. He speculates that immunological reactions might represent a kind of phylogenetic or species-level scale of time alteration and learning, while behavioral learning represents an ontogenetic or individual scale. The same basic interaction principle that gives rise to experience, he suggests, underlies both learning and immunity.
Wow. That's weaving it all together. Immunology, learning, time, space, synergy, consciousness. It really shows the sheer scope of his unified field theory ambition.
It absolutely does. He's trying to find the common denominator for seemingly disparate biological and physical processes within this framework of interacting energetic fields and space-time organization.
Okay, so bringing these threads back together now. We have space, time, and experience as different organizations at the same fundamental energetic whole. Grinberg argues this implies that different realities can and do literally coexist in the same physical space.
Yes, and our access to these different coexisting realities is determined primarily by our brain's capacity to decode their specific type of organization.
He uses examples from nature to illustrate this, right?
He does. Think about bats navigating using high-frequency sound echolocation. They inhabit the exact same physical space we do, but they perceive a completely different sonic reality structured by sound waves that are beyond our hearing range.
Or dogs. Their sense of smell.
Exactly. The incredible olfactory world of dogs, or even insects, detecting chemical information trails over vast distances. Information that's present in the space around us, but organized in a way our human sensory system isn't primarily tuned to decode. They live in a different olfactory reality within the same space.
So these natural examples show our human perceptual window is just one possibility. It's limited.
Precisely. And it suggests that perhaps through training, or maybe altered states of consciousness, our capacity to decode other forms of spatial organization, other coexisting realities, could potentially be expanded.
This leads directly to another really radical possibility he explores. The idea of direct decoding.
Yes. Since space itself, in his model, is this incredibly rich, information-filled, energetic structure, he theorizes that it should be possible, at least in principle, to decode this information directly with the brain's neural fields, without necessarily needing the standard sensory receptors, the eyes, the ears, the skin receptors.
Bypassing the senses entirely. How?
Well, normally our sensory receptors act as transducers. They convert external energy, light, sound waves, pressure, into the neural codes the brain understands. They perform the initial decoding step. But Grinberg argues the underlying mechanism, the interaction of the neural field with the spatial information field, could potentially persist even without that initial sensory input.
So theoretically, seeing without using the retina, hearing without the cochlea.
That's the controversial implication. He explicitly mentions the possibility of seeing without retinal activation, sometimes referred to as psychic seeing or eyeless sight. He even refers to the existence of people in institutes that apparently claim to teach this ability, citing a personal communication with someone named Ted Rowland.
This sounds very much like the theoretical basis he's proposing for phenomena like psychic abilities or remote viewing.
He suggests it is exactly that. The capacity to perceive information about distant objects, locations, or events without physical proximity or known sensory channels could, in his framework, be explained by the brain's neural field being able to directly interact with and decode the energetic information patterns inherent in the structure of space itself, regardless of distance. Phenomena like psychic psychometry, gaining information from objects, or remote viewing would fit within this model of direct decoding.
Okay, now we have to address perhaps the most extraordinary, almost science fiction-like claim that stems from his theory, the anti-gravity hypothesis.
Right. This follows logically, if boldly, from his definition of gravity itself. Remember, he posits that gravitational force is essentially a manifestation of decreased synergistic organization in the space around material bodies. Lower synergy equals gravity.
So to counteract gravity, to create anti-gravity.
Theoretically, you would need to do the opposite. You'd need to increase the synergy in the space surrounding an object.
Increase the information concentration, the redundancy, the temporal content. How on earth could one possibly do that?
That's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? He proposes it would require creating an energy field, presumably originating from some device or organism that actively modifies the surrounding space, imposing a higher degree of synergistic organization onto it, increasing the informational content, the inclusion of time, the redundancy, and perhaps decreasing the effective dimensionality of that space, thereby counteracting or reversing the conditions that normally produce gravitational attraction.
And where does he suggest such a field might come from? Not a machine, necessarily.
Intriguingly, he points primarily to the human brain as the potentially ideal instrument for achieving this.
The brain could create anti-gravity fields.
He hypothesizes that the brain, with its unique capacity to generate highly complex, potentially spatially expansive neural fields, and especially its theoretical ability to achieve extreme expansions of the present moment, reaching a state he refers to metaphorically as stopping time, might be the key. This state of maximum temporal inclusion and high neural coherence, he speculates, could generate a field of sufficiently high synergy around the organism to alter or even reverse local gravitational conditions.
That's staggering. Did he claim any evidence for this, even anecdotal?
He mentions some personal observations, which need to be taken with caution, of course. He reports instances where he and others, through intense concentration, could apparently hold the second hand of an analog clock motionless for brief periods. He hypothesized that significant gravitational alterations would be expected during such profound states of altered temporal perception, though he notes they hadn't directly measured gravitational changes at the time of writing.
Holding a second hand still.
He also references anecdotal reports from various traditions linking phenomena like levitation to specific psychological states often described in ways that sound like high inclusion, unity consciousness, or an expanded present, suggesting a potential correlation with his hypothesis.
And any experimental hints?
Yes, this is important. He mentions, tantalizingly, some very recent results obtained around 1978-79, close to when the book was published. These results, he claims, indicated that measurable increases in brain coherence, likely related to specific mental states, did correlate with detectable effects on gravitational forces. This, in his view, provided preliminary experimental support for the core hypothesis linking brain states, synergy, and gravity.
Brain coherence affecting gravity.
He even adds a brief cryptic mention of fire potentially having anti-gravity properties in this context, which is certainly intriguing but left undeveloped in the excerpt.
These are undeniably ideas ideas operating at the very edge of, or perhaps beyond, current scientific understanding. They require immense validation.
Absolutely, but it's crucial to see that within the logic of his own theoretical framework space as Syntergy, brain fields interacting with space, time linked to Syntergy, these possibilities, however extraordinary, follow as logical deductions.
Okay. Another concept he brings in, connecting to ancient ideas, is the Akashic record.
Yes, the ancient Eastern concept of a universal, non-physical library or record containing information about all events, thoughts, actions, and experiences that have ever occurred.
Like a cosmic hard drive.
Sort of. Western interpretations have varied. Some linked it to information somehow stored in complex organic compounds. Others, more relevant to Grinberg, connected it to the energetic organization of space itself, accessible perhaps through altered states or these neural fields we've been discussing.
And Grinberg had a specific take on its relevance, particularly for education.
He did. He believed that the primary educational task for humanity shouldn't just be about transmitting existing fixed information from person to person. Instead, he argued, education should focus on developing the techniques and capacities needed for individuals to directly decode the Akashic record to access this universal knowledge firsthand.
Learn how to read the cosmic database directly. How?
A key element in this process, he stressed, is cultivating the power of images. Developing the ability to evoke clear, stable, vivid mental images is, for him, crucial not just for general spiritual development, but specifically for accessing this deeper knowledge. It requires truly accepting internal experience, including mental imagery, as a valid and potent form of reality, allowing content that might normally be inhibited to surface consciously.
So mental images aren't just flimsy imagination. They're tools, gateways.
He viewed them as much more than passive imagination. He saw mental images as mini-patterns that possess a real energetic counterpart in the brain's neural field. And this field counterpart, he suggests, is powerful enough to potentially trigger changes or resonate with information patterns in the macrocosm, in the structure of space, or perhaps even in other consciousnesses.
So images are the mechanism for remote viewing or Akashic access.
In his framework, yes, they form the bridge. That's why he strongly advocated for educational systems that actively encourage and develop this capacity for internal image generation and manipulation, rather than suppressing it in favor of purely abstract or externalized knowledge.
This really reinforces the importance he places throughout his work on understanding patterns and structure.
Absolutely fundamental. For Grinberg, understanding patterns, which he defines as interconnected energetic elements forming complex wholes and grasping their underlying structures, is the key to understanding reality at every level.
He gave that example of the Guarani Indian.
Yes, how their language itself and their traditional weaving patterns apparently encode deep understanding about natural laws, relationships, and even the nature of time through the structure of the patterns used. He notes their word for time literally translates to something like to possess wisdom, directly linking wisdom to the ability to perceive and understand these underlying structures and patterns in the world and in consciousness.
Patterns aren't just visual things. They're the fundamental way energy and information organize themselves, whether it's in space, in matter, or in the brain.
Exactly. And patterns build on patterns' complex organization, giving rise to novel overall formations. Think of relationships between atoms forming molecules, relationships between cells forming tissues, relationships between humans forming societies. It's patterns of patterns all the way up and down.
And this pattern-based view reinforces his explanation for direct communication.
Yes, because if the brain's field can expand and interact with the universal field of patterns, then communication or information transfer across distance or time becomes plausible. Experience arises from the focused interaction with this global field, not necessarily requiring physical travel or signals moving through space in the conventional sense.
All these incredibly profound and complex ideas ultimately lead him to contemplate what he calls the paradox of experience.
Right. The paradox lies in the fact that subjective experience, consciousness, clearly emerges from these incredibly complex patterns of brain activity interacting with spatial organization. Yet, it doesn't seem to be reducible to just those patterns. It's not simply in them. It's something genuinely new, an original, emergent creation.
It's more than the sum of its parts.
Exactly. And he feels this emergent, seemingly irreducible nature of experience should inspire a sense of deep wonder and awe.
And underpinning this entire vast, intricate theoretical structure, he places a strong emphasis on one final principle.
Unity. Yes, this is crucial for him. He's very clear that any application of these powerful ideas, any attempt to deliberately manipulate space, time, or consciousness based on his theories, must be undertaken with a profound awareness of unity. The goal shouldn't be control for selfish ends, but understanding and connection.
It's an ethical foundation.
Absolutely. He believed that fostering the consciousness of belonging to a single interconnected being, the feeling of unity with all other entities in the universe, that this consciousness of unity is what's needed for humanity to navigate the future, perhaps aided by the kind of understanding his work aimed for. He stated that if his efforts could help strengthen this awareness of fundamental unity, he would consider his work worthwhile.
Wow. Dr. Jacobo Grinberg-Zylberbaum's work, just based on these excerpts from The Conscious Brain, is, well, it's an incredibly dense, highly interdisciplinary, and unbelievably ambitious attempt to forge a truly unified theory.
It really is. A bold synthesis trying to connect the absolute fundamentals of the universe space as this organized energy network, its property of synergy governing gravity and time, directly to the nitty-gritty of brain function, and ultimately to the deeply mysterious nature of subjective consciousness itself.
We've definitely navigated some seriously thought-provoking territory today. The idea that our familiar reality might be, in a sense, actively projected or materialized by our own brains interacting with space.
That space isn't emptiness, but this dynamic, information-rich network. That time and gravity aren't separate forces, but somehow products of this network's organization. It's synergy.
And the brain itself, not just as a passive receiver or processor, but as an active generator of an energy field that literally interacts with the fabric of space to co-create our subjective world through that synapse of experience. It's a radically different picture.
It is. And then there are the specific findings and implications that remarkable, if preliminary, experimental evidence for a learning-specific antibody, suggesting a deep link between learning and immunity. The way our brains demonstrably process meaning differently from raw sensory data.
And the more speculative but logically derived possibilities he entertained, like direct decoding of information from the spatial field, bypassing the senses, or even the potential, however remote it seems, of affecting gravity through focused consciousness and coherent neural fields.
His work fundamentally challenges us to reconsider the conventional boundaries we draw between mind and matter, between the brain and the universe. It paints this picture of reality as far more interconnected, far more dynamic, and potentially far more accessible to consciousness than we typically dare to imagine.
It's clearly a vast and complex body of work that definitely invites much deeper exploration and, crucially, rigorous scientific investigation, especially regarding those more extraordinary claims about fields and forces.
Without a doubt. Validation is key for those aspects.
And it leaves us, and you listening, with a pretty profound question to mull over. Inspired by his ideas on perception, materialization, and unity. If Grinberg's theory holds even a kernel of truth, if our brains are constantly engaged in this active process of materializing our reality from some underlying energetic matrix by decoding and interacting with the organization of space, then what aspects of our shared reality, the world we navigate every single day, might actually be open to, well, to transformation or perhaps to a much deeper level of perception than we currently believe is possible?
It's a really provocative thought, isn't it? That the perceived limits of our reality might be less about the fundamental nature of the universe out there and more about the current functional limits of our own brain's decoding capacity, our level of consciousness, and how we choose or are trained to focus our attention and intention.
Something to definitely ponder as you go about your day. Perhaps you'll start seeing the familiar world around you through a slightly different, maybe more dynamic lens.